At 1 in the morning on August 7, 1944, the German army tried to make itself disappear. 4 armored divisions were moving west through Normandy toward Mortain, through fog, darkness, and radio silence. No opening barrage, no warning thunder, no daylight columns for American fighter bombers to hunt. Every lesson the German army had learned about survival was inside that attack. And still the American shells were waiting, not searching, not walking slowly across fields. Waiting. The first salvos landed on road bends, crossroads, halt points, and assembly areas as if the Americans had the German map in front of them. Tanks stopped under trees and the shells found them there. Columns shifted direction, and the shells shifted first. Men who had survived Russia, Tunisia, and Normandy suddenly found themselves facing something they did not understand. American infantry seemed to know where to sit before the attack began. American artillery seemed to know where the tanks would stop before the tanks stopped, and the German crews below Hill 314 could not see the answer. They could see a hill, they could see boulders, they could see muzzle flashes sometimes, and smoke, and men in foxholes who refused to run. But the real weapon was not on the hill. It was a web, a 5-pound radio in a rifle company, a backpack FM set in a muddy foxhole, a lieutenant with a map already marked before the first engine turned over, a fire direction center miles behind the line, a codebreaker far away in Britain, and circling so slowly that German pilots would have laughed at it in 1940, a fabric airplane with a 65 horsepower engine and no armor at all. The Panzer crews were looking for spies. Hitler would look for treason. What they had run into was something harder to imagine, an army that had learned how to see. The problem was older than the Second World War. Artillery could kill at distances no rifleman could dream of, but guns were blind beyond the next ridge. A battery could throw steel 10 miles away only if somebody, somewhere, could look at the target and tell the gunners where the shells had landed. In the First World War, that eye was often a man under a balloon, suspended in the sky and hoping no enemy fighter found him. Later, it was a forward observer on a hill with a telephone wire running back through mud that shells cut as easily as string. So the most destructive weapon on the battlefield carried a ridiculous weakness. It could hit what it could not reach, but it could not hit what it could not see. The United States solved one half of that weakness before most people noticed. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, artillery instructors built the Fire Direction Center, a place where maps, plotting boards, telephones, and trained mathematics could turn one observer's report into massed fire from many guns. That mattered. A single battery was dangerous. Several battalions landing together were not a bigger version of the same thing. They were a different thing entirely. They turned artillery from scattered violence into a coordinated machine. But a brain without eyes is still trapped in the dark. That was the part Lieutenant Colonel William W. Ford could not let go. Ford was an artilleryman. He was also a civilian pilot. And he kept asking an uncomfortable question. Why should the artillery beg another branch for eyes? The Army Air Corps had observation aircraft, but they were expensive, fast, based too far back, and controlled by people with their own priorities. A gunner who needed 5 minutes of observation over one tree line could not always wait for a formal request to climb a chain of command. Ford wanted something smaller, not a fighter, not a bomber, a farm field airplane, fabric over steel tube, cheap enough to buy in quantity, slow enough to circle over one patch of ground until the observer understood it, simple enough to land on a road, a pasture, or a scraped strip of dirt beside a gun park. The idea sounded embarrassing to serious airmen. Then came the pre-war maneuvers in Tennessee and Louisiana. Light aircraft manufacturers lent the Army small civilian planes and pilots to prove the concept. The tiny machines watched movements, carried messages, corrected fire, and found units that were supposed to be hidden. They became so useful that the umpires did the purest thing an experiment can do. They banned them. The side with the little planes was gaining too much advantage. That was the verdict that mattered. The aircraft earned their nickname when one bounced across rough ground near Fort Bliss, and a general said it looked like a grasshopper. The name stayed. By 1942, Ford had his school at Fort Sill. Artillerymen were learning to fly machines that 2 men could push by hand. The Piper L-4 was the military version of the Cub. It could cruise around 75 miles an hour, stall at less than 40, and loiter where fast aircraft could only pass. It carried no guns. It wore no armor. Its empty weight was under 700 pounds. It cost roughly what the government might spend on a good staff car. On paper, it looked harmless. That was part of its power, because Ford insisted on one rule that changed everything. The men in the cockpit would be artillerymen first and pilots second. They were not aviators casually looking at the ground. They were gunners lifted into the air. They knew what a shell burst meant. They knew the difference between a correction of 50 yards and a correction of 200. They knew when a target was worth one battery, and when the whole line should answer. The plane was only the perch. The weapon was the observer connected to the guns. But eyes alone do not make an army see. The body has to hear them. That second half came from a factory in Chicago, where the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola, built radios that changed the battlefield more quietly than any tank. The SCR-536 was small enough for one man to carry and operate. Pull out the antenna, and the set came alive. A rifle company could put radios into the hands of platoons and commanders who in earlier wars would have shouted, sent runners, or waited for wire crews to crawl through fire. Then came the SCR-300, the backpack radio that mattered even more. It used FM. Frequency modulation gave American combat nets a clarity that older AM radios could rarely match in the noise of battle. The set weighed about 32 pounds with its battery. It had dozens of channels. In good conditions, it could reach several miles. More important, it was made for infantry. A man in a ditch could speak to a man in another ditch. A forward observer could speak to the guns. A tank could speak to another tank. A plane above the lines could feed the same fire system as the lieutenant crouched below it. And when those reports reached the Fire Direction Center, they did not vanish into paperwork. They became numbers, elevations, deflections, charges, corrections. A private sees armor moving near an orchard. A platoon radio passes the warning. A forward observer fixes the target. The Fire Direction Center plots it. The guns turn. Minutes later, the orchard is under steel. That was the machine the Germans could not see. Not a single invention. A nervous system. Its first day in battle almost killed it. In November 1942, during the landings in North Africa, Captain Ford Alcorn led 3 L-4s off the deck of the USS Ranger. They were tiny aircraft leaving a carrier at sea into a hard wind, bound for a battlefield where almost nobody had been told to expect them. The Navy opened fire. American anti-aircraft crews ashore opened fire. Alcorn's cockpit was shot up by his own side before Vichy French machine gun fire wounded him on the ground. It was a disaster made of coordination failures, the kind of disaster that can bury a new idea before anyone admits the idea was not the problem. From his hospital bed, Alcorn wrote that the concept was sound. The system had failed around it. Ford pushed that judgment upward, and the program survived. By Sicily and Italy, the little aircraft had become too useful to leave behind. When their range was too short to reach the landing beaches, engineers put narrow flight decks on tank landing ships, turning LSTs into improvised carriers for Grasshoppers. Think about that priority. The United States was willing to build pocket carriers for fabric observation planes because commanders wanted those eyes over the guns on the first morning. Once the routine matured, it looked almost boring. An L-4 circled on the friendly side of the line, a few hundred or 1,000 feet up. One man flew, the other searched with binoculars. A muzzle flash appeared in a wood line. A dust plume rose behind a barn. A vehicle glinted under camouflage netting. A grid went down by radio. The first shells landed. A correction followed. Then the real weight came in. From the ground, the Cub seemed to do nothing. It drifted. It puttered. It hung there with irritating patience. German artillerymen learned what that patience meant. Fire one round while the Cub was overhead, and the observer could mark the flash. The response might come from a battalion. It might come from several. The cost of revealing a gun became so high that silence often looked safer than shooting. A captured German described the effect with brutal simplicity. When the Cub was above them, everything stopped except their eyes. That was not just observation. That was suppression without a weapon. Every German battery that stayed quiet lost its own eyes. Every convoy that waited under trees lost time. Every headquarters that delayed movement because a slow airplane was overhead gave the American network another minute to think. And then in August 1944, Hitler gave that network its perfect test. The German counterattack at Mortain was meant to cut the American breakout in half. The Allies had broken loose from the Normandy beachhead, and German command wanted one armored blow westward to Avranches in the sea. The plan depended on invisibility. Attack at night. Use fog. Keep radios silent. Do not fire a warning barrage. Move fast before American air power can wake up. It was a battle plan written to blind the Americans. But a 4-division armored attack cannot assemble without leaving a trace somewhere. One of those traces came from the Luftwaffe, arranging night fighter cover. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park read enough of the traffic for the warning to reach General Omar Bradley. Bradley acted. Artillery battalions were shifted into the exact corridor the German armor needed to use. Guns that had not been there were there before the columns arrived. So before the first German tank reached the roads west of Mortain, the invisible system had already heard the attack in hail. At first, the German plan seemed to work. Fog kept fighter bombers away. Some American positions were surprised. Mortain itself fell quickly. German armor pushed through roads and villages in the dark. But the attack did not break open. It bent. And then it hit Hill 314. East of Mortain, the hill rose about 600 feet above the valley. It was steep, broken, and ugly with rock. The slopes were hard for tanks. The boulders gave infantry places to disappear. From the top, a man could see the roads the Germans needed. Roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, 30th Division ended up surrounded there. Their senior surviving officer was Captain Reynold Eriksson. With them were 2 artillery forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss. Weiss was 20 years old. He had been in France barely more than a week. Now he was looking down at the movement of 4 armored divisions. The key was not that Weiss and Bartz were brave, though they were. The key was what they had done before the Germans arrived. They had studied the roads below the hill, junctions, bends, approaches, likely stopping places, likely assembly areas. They had assigned those points reference numbers and prepared the firing data. The battlefield had already been solved. That is the detail the German crews never saw. When a column moved into one of those places, the men on the hill did not have to discover the target from nothing. They did not need a slow calculation under fire. A voice could send a number by radio, and the guns already knew what that number meant. The Germans attacked the hill in fog. The prearranged fire broke the assault. They tried darkness before dawn, believing darkness would protect them from aimed artillery. But the guns were not aiming at what they saw in that moment. They were firing at what the observers had already understood. White phosphorus drove men from cover. High explosive caught them in the open. Corps artillery gave the hill priority because as long as that radio lived, the hill was more than a defensive position. It was a tower wired into the entire American gun line. Then the hill began to run out of everything. Food disappeared, water disappeared, medical supplies disappeared. The wounded lay among the rocks. The living searched the dead for ammunition. German fire cut and hammered the summit. Supply drops missed, drifted away, or fell into German hands. Grasshoppers tried to fly low enough to drop supplies and were shot to pieces. Through it all, the men protected the one thing that could not fail, the radio. They turned it off between missions. They nursed the batteries. They treated electrical power as life itself because everyone on Hill 314 understood the equation. If the radio died, the guns went blind. If the guns went blind, the hill became only 700 surrounded men with rifles. At one point, the 230th Field Artillery tried a solution no manual would have recommended. Gunners hollowed out 105mm smoke shells, packed them with bandages, sulfa, morphine, and plasma, and fired medical supplies onto the hill. The force of the shot smashed some of the contents, but some of the supplies arrived. Medicine had been delivered by cannon. By the time relief reached the summit on August 12, roughly 300 of the defenders were dead or wounded, but the German drive had failed. The roads west were still closed. The armored divisions had spent the crucial days bleeding under fire they could not locate and could not explain. To a Panzer crew down in the valley, it must have felt impossible. Move at night and shells arrive. Stop under trees and shells arrive. Shift to another road and the fire is already there. They were not being outshot in the old sense. They were being outknown. That is why the German explanations became so revealing. Hitler did not see a network. He saw betrayal. After Mortain failed, suspicion fell on Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. The failure of the counterattack was folded into the paranoia that followed the July bomb plot. Kluge's hours out of contact during the collapse made him look, in Hitler's mind, like a man negotiating with the enemy. He was dismissed, ordered back toward Germany. He never reached Berlin alive. The mistake was enormous, but it was also understandable in one narrow way. Treason was a category Hitler knew how to imagine. A field marshal could betray him. A staff officer could leak plans. A spy could hide in a village. But what had actually beaten the attack did not look dramatic enough. A cub, a map, a battery, a radio set, a plotting room, a code-breaking office far away. None of those things alone looked like the answer to 4 Panzer divisions. Together they were the answer. German officers below Hitler understood more of the problem, but still not all of it. They learned that daylight movement under American observation was nearly suicidal. They pushed movement toward dusk, darkness, and bad weather. If the American eye was the problem, then fog should be the solution. Lorraine, September 1944, tested that hope at Arracourt. German armored forces attacked the American 4th Armored Division through thick morning fog. The attackers had new Panthers, powerful guns, and a plan to move while aircraft were blind. For a few hours, The fog gave them what they wanted. It hid them from the sky. It also hid the men waiting for them. The Americans had scouted the ground, wired their outposts together, and chosen positions where the fog reduced the German advantage in long-range gunnery. Panthers blundered close. Shermans appeared from angles the Germans did not expect. Self-propelled howitzers fired over open sights when the fight came too near. The fog did not remove the American network. It only changed which layer mattered most. When the sky was blind, ground observers still talked. Outposts still warned each other. Fire direction centers still plotted. Commanders who understood the terrain still made the fog work for them. And when the fog lifted, the upper layer returned. Major Charles Carpenter, a former high school history teacher flying an L-4 called Rosie the Rocketer, had mounted bazookas under its wings. When the weather cleared near Arracourt, he dove at German armor in a fabric airplane never designed to attack tanks. It was outrageous. It was also a sign that the war had changed. The little plane that once survived because German gunners hesitated was now feared enough to draw every weapon below it. Carpenter kept diving anyway. By the end of the battle, German armored strength had been broken down to a fraction of what had gone in. Fog had not saved the attack. It had proved that the airplane was only one visible layer of a deeper system. The Germans could hide from the Cub for a morning. They could not hide from an army that had learned to share information faster than they could exploit confusion. There was a cruel irony in that. The Panzer force itself had been built on radio. The ability of German tank commanders to communicate inside fast-moving armored formations helped make blitzkrieg terrifying in 1939 and 1940. Radio made speed useful. It let armor concentrate, turn, exploit, and break through. But by 1944, every transmission was also a risk. Every coordination problem pushed men toward radios. Every radio wave moved through an atmosphere the Allies were learning to listen to. The weapon Germany had used to make armored war fast had become part of what made German armor visible. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough. The final symbol came in April 1945, when the war in Europe was nearly finished. Near Dannenberg, about 100 miles west of Berlin, First Lieutenants Duane Francis and William Martin were flying an L-4 named Miss Me for the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion. Below them, skimming near the treetops, they spotted a Fieseler Storch, the German Army's famous observation aircraft. The Storch was, by design, the better airplane. It was stronger, more sophisticated, and respected around the world for its short takeoff and landing ability. Francis dove anyway. The Americans opened the side doors of the L-4 and fired their .45 caliber pistols at the German aircraft. Francis held the control stick between his knees to reload. Rounds struck the Storch. It turned too low, clipped the ground, and crashed. The Americans landed nearby and took the German crew prisoner. An observation airplane had defeated another observation airplane with handguns. As an engineering story, it sounds absurd. As a war story, it is perfect. Germany had built a superior observation aircraft. America had built a superior observation system. The L-4 was never the whole answer. It was one nerve ending of a larger body. It made sense only because radios, observers, maps, code breakers, fire direction centers, and artillery battalions were connected behind it. That is what the Panzer crews at Mortain could not explain. They searched for a visible cause because that is what battlefield experience teaches a man to do. Find the gun, find the observer, find the traitor, find the trick. But information does not always give itself a shape. Sometimes it arrives as a hill that cannot be surprised. Sometimes it arrives as riflemen who do not run when armor appears. Sometimes it arrives as a first salvo that lands where the tank commander has just stopped. From the German side of the valley, information looked like courage. From the American side, courage had been wired to information. The men on Hill 315 were not data points. They were hungry, thirsty, wounded, exhausted human beings holding rock with rifles and a dying battery. The pilots in the Grasshoppers were not safe observers. They flew unarmed, low and slow, close enough for rifle fire and machine guns to tear fabric from their wings. The radio men carried weight that made them targets. The artillerymen behind the line worked numbers that decided whether help arrived on the enemy or on their own men. The network was powerful because people trusted it under pressure. A lieutenant spoke a number into static. A battery miles away obeyed. An infantryman stayed in his hole because he believed the guns would come. That belief changed behavior. It changed what men could endure. It changed what armor could risk. And that is the part no interrogation report could fully capture. The German veterans were not simply jealous of American firepower. Many of them had lived through artillery before. What unsettled them was the collapse of their model of war. They expected infantry to scatter when tanks came close. Instead, American infantry stayed in the exact places tanks had to pass. They expected artillery to need time to grope for targets. Instead, it landed as if the roads had been numbered in advance. They expected fog and darkness to hide movement. Instead, fog and darkness hid them only from the parts of the network that used eyes. The rest kept listening. By 1944, war was no longer only steel against steel, courage against courage, or armor against infantry. It was also speed of recognition. Who noticed first? Who transmitted first? Who believed the report? Who could turn a sighting into fire before the enemy turned confusion into opportunity? Germany built better tanks. America built a better way for ordinary men to tell each other what they saw. And on the roads below Mortain, that difference became lethal. The Panzer crews were not beaten by magic. They were beaten by a nervous system they could not see, and by the men brave enough to keep it alive.